Good morning, Stallions. In today's lesson, we'll be learning about the term mean. Our specific learning objectives include given a data set, calculate the mean, and then also use the mean to summarize the center of distribution. Some vocabulary for today's lesson includes data set, distribution, measure of central tendency, mean, and average. And the essential question that we'll be answering today is, how is the mean helpful in describing data? At this time, if you are able to print out at home, go ahead and you can print out the blank notes that are included in the Google Slides for this week. If not, just use your math journal and take notes in there and follow along with me. So the mean of a data set is a measure of central tendency. So let's look at this term data set. So by data set, all we mean by that is just a collection of values related to a particular subject. For instance, we could have a data set of student test scores on a particular test and find the mean of those test scores. And then by measure of central tendency, a measure of central tendency is just a way to take a set of values and you find a single value to describe the center of the data, so the average of the data. So the mean is the average of a data set, and most of you should be familiar with that term average. It is calculated by adding all of the values and then dividing the sum by the amount of values in the data set. And we're going to look at an example here. So the example is asking us to find the mean of the following data set. And in this case, our data set just includes a bunch of different numbers. Those are our values. So step one, we'll add all of the values together. So we just have to fill in some of the ones they're missing here. Okay, so we add all these numbers up together. If you do that, we're going to get a total of 42. Now, for step two, we'll count all of the data items in the data set. And by that, we just mean the number of values. And I'll write that in parentheses below here. We just mean how many values are there. So you'll see that there are 10 values in this data set. Step three, we will divide the sum by the total amount of values. And I'm just going to abbreviate amount. So for this example, that means we'll take 42, we'll divide it by 10. And remember, guys, when you have a whole number, there is technically a decimal point to the right of that whole number. If we're dividing by 10, look at the number 10. There's 1 0 in the number 10. So here's a little shortcut. So divide by 10, we will move one place to the left. Okay, and that's going to give us 4.2. So 4.2 is the number we would use to describe the center of the data set. Okay, so we're going to go on and we're going to look at a few more examples together before you guys begin practicing on your own. So for example 1, it says determine the mean cost of a children's ticket for the 5 different museums shown in the pictograph. Use the mean to summarize the center of distribution. Okay, center of distribution. That's just another way of saying that's the measure of central tendency. And by distribution specifically, we're just talking about how the data is spread out. So we're essentially going to take all of the values and we want to distribute them equally, in this case, amongst the 5 museums to figure out what the mean or what the average cost is for a children's ticket. So You can see up top there, it shows you how much money each children's ticket costs for each of those 5 museums. And then here we're taking those dollars and we're distributing them equally amongst each museum. Once we do that, we can see here that each museum costs an average of $9. So the data are centered around $9 per ticket. Let's move on to example 2. In example 2, we have 4 friends and they each have some cookies. So Claire has 5 cookies, Brooke has 3 cookies, and Deandra has 6 cookies, and then there's Lucy with 2 cookies. Find the mean number of cookies. So again, we are looking for a single value that can be used to represent this entire data set. So we're looking for the average number of cookies that each friend has. Whenever possible, I always recommend drawing out, making a visual representation of the problem. So we see each of the friends, we see how many cookies each of them have. Now, we're going to imagine that the girls combine all of their cookies. They just throw them all into a bowl all together. And then we imagine them distributing them equally, dividing them equally amongst the 4 of them. So we want each of them to have the same number of cookies. If they do that, then each girl will have 4 cookies. So that means the mean, or the average number of cookies each friend has, is 4. So the data are centered around 4 cookies. So let's look here for a moment. So our key idea here, we can think of the mean as the number of cookies each girl would have if they were equally distributed among the 4 girls. Let's move on to another example. So as you know, we have multiple ways that we can represent a collection of data or a collection of values. And in example 3, we have a dot plot. It shows the recorded high temperatures for 6 days in Little Rock, Arkansas. And it asks us to determine the mean temperature. Use the mean to summarize the center of distribution. So we're going to think about this in steps. So in step 1, we will take the sum of the data. So you can see it's adding up all the data there that we have on the temperatures. In step 2, we need to figure out the number of data items. So let's see, let's count. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 data items. That's where this 6 came from, okay? And then in step 3, we're going to take the sum of the data and we will divide it by the number of data items to get our mean, which in this case is 48 degrees. So the data are centered around 48 degrees. So again, that's that single value we would use to summarize this data set. Okay, let's move on to another example. So for example 4, it says the dot plot shows the number of runs a baseball team had for each game of a 4-game series. Determine the mean number of runs for the series. Use the mean to summarize the center of the distribution. So at this time, I'd like you to pause the video and take a few minutes to see if you can work out this problem on your own. Okay, hopefully you were able to work out this problem, and now we're going to review it together. So step 1, remember, is to take the sum of the data. So again, we have number of runs, and we have 4 values here. We have 1, we have 3, we have 4, and we have 4 again. Step 2, I need to count up the number of data items. So 1, 2, 3, 4. We have 4 data items. That's what number goes in my denominator. So step 3 is where I will divide the sum of the data, and in this case I have a total of 12 in the numerator. I divide it by the number of data items. Now, remember guys, a fraction is just another way to represent a division problem. And sometimes we have whole numbers hiding inside fractions and we need to unmask them. So let's look at this fraction. If we read it from top to bottom like a division problem, we would have 12 divided by 4, which in this case equals 3. So the mean number of runs for the series is 3. The data are centered around 3 runs. All right, we're going to move on to one more example before you guys move on to do some independent practice. Okay, in our last example, we have a bar graph. And in the bar graph, we are measuring the number of stories for 5 different Texas skyscrapers. So the problem's asking us to determine the mean for the data set, use the mean to summarize the center of distribution. So again, let's do step 1. We need to sum up the data items. So we're adding up the number of stories for each one of those Texas skyscrapers. And then step 2, we need to divide by the number of data items. So again, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, I have 5. I have 5 data items in this case. Okay, step 3. I'm going to go ahead. So if I sum up all those the stories in each of the Texas skyscrapers, I'm going to get a total of 331. Remember, I'm dividing that by 5. Okay, and when I work out that math, I'm going to get 66.2. So in this case, the mean or the average number of stories for these 5 Texas skyscrapers is 66.2 stories. And therefore the data are centered around 66.2 stories. To summarize, I hope we've learned that the mean is helpful because it allows us to take a set of values and describe it using a single value. So now I want you guys to move on to your practice or your fan work. And then after you do your practice for calculating means, you will move on to the lesson on median and mode.